6 years ago, James Parker, a 45-year-old wildlife photographer from Denver, and his adventurous 14-year-old son, Lucas, disappeared during what was supposed to be a routine father-son expedition in Alaska's remote Denali wilderness. They vanished without leaving any traces, plunging the Parker family into an abyss of tragedy and depression, while their community was left in utter confusion and disbelief. The disappearance sent shockwaves through their tight-knit suburban neighborhood, where James was known as the reliable neighbor who never missed a barbecue, and Lucas was the boy who helped elderly residents with their groceries every Saturday morning. Before we continue, please subscribe, like this video, and hit the notification bell. This helps our channel bring you more stories like this one. James Parker wasn't just any weekend warrior venturing into the wilderness unprepared. A former park ranger with 15 years of experience in Colorado's Rocky Mountain National Park, he had transitioned to professional wildlife photography after a back injury forced his early retirement from active duty. His expertise was legendary among outdoor enthusiasts. He could read weather patterns like a book, navigate by stars when GPS failed, and had survived situations that would have killed lesser men. His photography work had been featured in National Geographic, Outside Magazine, and numerous conservation publications, making him a respected voice in wilderness preservation circles. Lucas Parker, his youngest son, was the embodiment of youthful adventure, tempered by his father's careful training. At 14, he was already an accomplished photographer in his own right, having won several regional competitions for young nature photographers. Unlike many teenagers glued to video games and social media, Lucas spent his free time studying animal behavior, learning wilderness survival techniques, and begging his father for increasingly challenging outdoor adventures. His bedroom walls were covered with his own wildlife photographs and topographical maps of places he dreamed of exploring. The father-son duo had been planning this particular expedition for over a year. James had been commissioned to create a documentary series about wildlife adaptation during Alaska's transitional seasons, and Lucas had campaigned relentlessly to be included in what would be his first major wilderness expedition outside the lower 48 states. "Dad, I'm ready," Lucas had argued during countless dinner table conversations. "I know the survival basics, I can handle the camera equipment, and I promise I won't slow you down." Their departure from Denver International Airport on October 12, 2018, was captured in family photos that would later become precious final memories. James looked confident and prepared, wearing his signature olive green field jacket and carrying the weather-beaten Nikon that had accompanied him on dozens of expeditions. Lucas appeared ecstatic, practically bouncing with excitement as he posed with his own camera gear, his backpack nearly as large as he was. The flight to Anchorage was uneventful, and their connection to the charter flight service went smoothly. Bush pilot Captain Randy Morrison, a 30-year veteran of Alaskan wilderness flights, later recalled that both James and Lucas appeared well prepared and knowledgeable about their intended destination. "James knew exactly where he wanted to be dropped off," Morrison testified during subsequent investigations. "He showed me detailed topographical maps, had backup routes planned, and discussed weather contingencies." Lucas was asking intelligent questions about the terrain. They seemed like a father-son team that had done this kind of thing before. Their destination was a remote area, approximately 40 miles northeast of Denali National Park's main visitor areas, accessible only by small aircraft or days of difficult hiking. James had chosen this location based on months of research into wildlife migration patterns and seasonal behavior changes. The area was known for its pristine wilderness and abundant photo opportunities, but it was also notoriously isolated. The nearest human habitation was over 60 miles away, and cell phone coverage was non-existent. The plan they filed with Morrison's charter service was methodical and conservative. Establish a base camp on day 1, spend 3 days photographing and documenting wildlife behavior, then return to the pickup site for their scheduled October 17th extraction. They carried enough supplies for 8 days, including emergency rations, cold weather gear rated to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, satellite communication equipment, and 2 separate emergency beacon devices. When October 17th arrived without any sign of the Parker team at their designated pickup location, Morrison immediately contacted Alaska State Troopers. Years of experience in the Alaskan wilderness had taught him that delays in remote areas usually meant serious trouble. In 30 years of flying these wilderness routes, "I've learned that experienced outdoorsmen don't miss pickup times unless something has gone very wrong," Morrison later explained. Sarah Parker received the phone call that every wilderness family dreads at 6:47 p.m. Mountain Time on October 17th. Alaska State Troopers informed her that her husband and son had failed to appear at their scheduled extraction point and that search and rescue operations were being initiated immediately. The caller assured her that James's experience and preparation gave them reason for optimism, but the underlying concern in the trooper's voice was unmistakable. The news devastated the Parker household in ways that extended far beyond Sarah's immediate panic. Michael Parker, James's 21-year-old son from his first marriage, rushed home from college when he heard the news. The extended family, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, began an anxious vigil that would stretch across days, then weeks, then years. James's elderly father, a Korean War veteran who had taught his son woodland skills decades earlier, was particularly distraught. "That boy knows the woods better than anyone," he kept repeating. Something terrible must have happened. Police investigators immediately began examining every aspect of the Parkers' expedition planning. They reviewed equipment manifests, studied the route plans James had filed, and consulted with wilderness experts about potential hazards in the target area. Weather services provided detailed reports showing that conditions had been favorable when the Parkers departed, with no major storms predicted during their planned expedition window. The initial theories focused on equipment failure or medical emergencies. Perhaps James had suffered another back injury, or Lucas had been hurt in a fall. Maybe their communication equipment had malfunctioned, leaving them unable to signal for help, but still capable of surviving until rescue teams could locate them. These optimistic scenarios sustained the family's hope during the first critical days of searching. However, as search teams began covering the vast terrain where the Parkers had vanished, the complete absence of any trace became increasingly ominous. Experienced searchers expected to find some evidence of their passage: abandoned equipment, temporary campsites, or at minimum, footprints and other sign of human activity. The wilderness seemed to have swallowed James and Lucas Parker completely, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt their family and the search and rescue community for years to come. The case quickly garnered regional and then national media attention. James's reputation as a skilled outdoorsman and photographer, combined with the heart-wrenching image of a father and teenage son lost in Alaska's unforgiving wilderness, captured public imagination and sympathy. News crews descended on the Parker home in Denver, interviewing neighbors who described James as meticulous and safety-conscious, and teachers who praised Lucas as responsible beyond his years. Sarah Parker found herself thrust into an unwanted spotlight, fielding questions from reporters, while trying to coordinate with search teams and hold her remaining family together. The media attention brought offers of help from across the country: volunteer searchers, psychics claiming supernatural insights, and well-meaning but unqualified individuals who wanted to join the search efforts. Managing these offers while staying focused on legitimate search activities became a full-time job that Sarah never wanted. As the first week stretched into a second, then a third, the initial optimism began fading into grim determination. The harsh reality of Alaska's wilderness began asserting itself. If James and Lucas were still alive after so much time in increasingly cold conditions, they would need immediate medical attention. If they weren't alive, finding their bodies in the vast expanse of wilderness would be like searching for needles in a haystack the size of several states. The official search operation for James and Lucas Parker commenced at dawn on October 18, 2018, mobilizing what would become one of the most extensive wilderness rescue efforts in Alaska's recorded history. Search and Rescue Coordinator Captain Michael Torres, a 25-year veteran of Alaskan emergency operations, assembled a force that included Alaska State Troopers, National Park Service Rangers, Civil Air Patrol volunteers, local search and rescue teams, and specialized wilderness tracking units. From the moment we received the missing persons report, we knew we were racing against time and weather, Torres later recalled during official debriefings. James Parker's reputation preceded him. This wasn't some tourist who had wandered off a marked trail. When someone with his level of experience goes missing, it usually means the situation is extremely serious. The search headquarters was established at the Talkeetna Ranger Station, chosen for its proximity to the target area and its sophisticated communication capabilities. Large-scale topographical maps covered the walls, marked with colored pins indicating search sectors, known hazards, and potential shelter locations. Weather monitoring equipment provided real-time updates on conditions in the field, while radio operators maintained constant contact with search teams spread across hundreds of square miles of wilderness. The initial search strategy focused on James's filed expedition plan and the most likely routes between their intended photography locations. Ground teams on snowmobiles and ATVs followed creek beds, ridgelines, and game trails that experienced outdoorsmen typically used for navigation. Each team included at least one member familiar with the specific terrain they were covering, as well as medical personnel capable of providing emergency treatment if the missing men were found alive but injured. Aerial search operations began with Civil Air Patrol Cessna aircraft equipped with high-resolution cameras and GPS tracking systems. Pilots flew careful grid patterns at low altitudes, photographing every potential campsite, shelter, or anomaly that might indicate human presence. The photography was systematic and exhaustive. Every image was catalogued by GPS coordinates and examined by specialists trained to identify signs of human activity from the air. As weather conditions remained favorable during the first week, helicopter operations expanded the search capabilities dramatically. Alaska Army National Guard UH-60 Blackhawks carried teams of searchers to remote locations inaccessible by ground vehicles, while smaller Bell helicopters conducted detailed sweeps of creek beds and valley floors where James and Lucas might have taken shelter. The searchers discovered tantalizing clues that seemed to confirm the Parkers had reached their intended destination. At a remote backcountry ranger station approximately 20 miles from their drop-off point, investigators found James's signature in the visitor logbook dated October 13, 2018. His entry indicated they were proceeding to photography site Alpha as planned, and noted, "Excellent weather conditions, morale high." This discovery triggered intensive searching in the areas James had designated as Photography Site Alpha on his expedition maps. The location was a series of small lakes and meadows known for abundant wildlife activity during the seasonal transition period. Ground teams found clear evidence of human activity in the area: disturbed vegetation where someone had set up a camera tripod, areas of flattened grass consistent with camping, and what appeared to be human footprints preserved in mud near one of the lakes. The footprint analysis provided both hope and concern. Wildlife tracking expert Daniel Yazzie, brought in from Arizona specifically for his human tracking expertise, determined that the prints belonged to two individuals matching the approximate sizes and stride patterns of James and Lucas Parker. However, the direction of the tracks suggested they had been moving away from their intended pickup location, heading deeper into the wilderness rather than returning to their extraction point. "The tracks tell a story, but it's not the story we hoped to hear," Yazzie reported to search coordinators. "These prints showed two people moving purposefully, but not in the direction they should have been going if they were trying to get home. Something caused them to change their plans." Further investigation revealed additional disturbing evidence. At a small general store in the tiny settlement of Cantwell, approximately 50 miles from the search area, security camera footage showed a man matching James's description, purchasing additional cold weather gear and asking detailed questions about weather forecasts for the region. The timestamp showed October 14th, indicating that James had made an unplanned trip out of the wilderness for additional supplies. The store clerk, Mary Takatsuki, remembered the encounter clearly. "He seemed worried about the weather," she told investigators. "He kept asking about storm systems moving in from the west, and he bought extra batteries, hand warmers, and some emergency food supplies. He mentioned his son was with him and that they might need to extend their trip if conditions got bad." This revelation forced search coordinators to reconsider their assumptions about the Parkers' timeline and location. If James had driven out to Cantwell on October 14th, it meant they had been in the wilderness longer than originally planned, and might have been dealing with weather conditions different from the initial forecasts. The search area was expanded to include routes between their known photography sites and the Cantwell area, as well as alternative locations where they might have taken shelter if the weather had forced them to seek emergency refuge. This expansion stretched search resources thin, but was deemed necessary given the new evidence about their movements. Search dogs were brought in during the second week of operations, including specialized cadaver dogs and live scent tracking animals. The dogs showed strong interest in several areas, but were unable to establish consistent tracks due to weather conditions that had deteriorated since the Parkers' disappearance. Rain, snow, and wind had obscured or eliminated many scent trails that might have provided crucial directional information. The most promising discovery came on October 25th, when searchers found the Parkers' rental vehicle parked at a remote trailhead, approximately 30 miles from where their expedition had originally been scheduled to conclude. The vehicle was locked and secured, with all backup supplies still inside, exactly as James had organized them. A detailed note on the dashboard outlined their planned route and expected return date, along with emergency contact information and their planned photography locations. Personal items found in the vehicle provided insights into their final preparations. James had left detailed weather reports printed from internet sources, showing his awareness of changing conditions. Lucas had left a journal entry dated October 14th, expressing excitement about the trip and his pride in helping his father with the documentary project. "Dad says I'm getting really good with the camera," Lucas had written. "Maybe someday I'll be a famous photographer like him." The discovery of the rental car triggered an intensive ground search of the surrounding area. If the Parkers had returned to this location after their supply run to Cantwell, it suggested they had intended to continue their expedition rather than abort it due to weather concerns. However, it also meant they had been carrying all their essential supplies on foot into wilderness areas that were becoming increasingly difficult to search as winter weather intensified. Search teams used the car's location as a base camp for expanded ground operations. They found intermittent signs of human passage along several trails leading away from the trailhead, broken vegetation, disturbed ground, and occasional partial footprints that might have belonged to the missing men. However, these signs became increasingly sparse and difficult to follow as the trails led into more rugged terrain. Metal detectors were employed to search for dropped equipment or personal items that might indicate the Parkers' route. The detectors revealed several false alarms, old cans, abandoned camping gear from previous visitors, and natural mineral deposits that triggered the sensors. However, they also discovered a lens cap that Sarah Parker later identified as belonging to one of Lucas's camera lenses, found approximately 2 miles from the trailhead, along a path leading toward higher elevation. As October gave way to November, search conditions became increasingly challenging. Early winter storms began hitting the region with unusual intensity, bringing heavy snow, high winds, and dangerous cold that made both aerial and ground operations hazardous. Search helicopter crews reported whiteout conditions and severe turbulence that prevented safe flying on many days. Ground teams faced their own challenges as snow depths increased and temperatures dropped well below freezing. The terrain that had been merely difficult in October became treacherous in November, with hidden ice patches, unstable snow bridges over streams, and visibility reduced to mere feet during storm periods. Several searchers required medical evacuation for cold-related injuries, highlighting the extreme conditions that James and Lucas would have faced if they were still alive. Despite these challenges, search operations continued with remarkable dedication. Volunteer searchers came from across Alaska and the continental United States, many of them experienced outdoorsmen who felt a personal connection to James's plight as a fellow wilderness enthusiast. The search effort became a testament to the outdoor community's commitment to never leaving anyone behind, even when the odds of success grew increasingly slim. Captain Torres made the difficult decision to scale back active search operations on November 18, 2018, after 31 days of intensive efforts. "We had covered every reasonable area where they might have taken shelter," he announced at a press conference that brought tears to Sarah Parker's eyes. "Weather conditions have made further searching not just unproductive, but dangerous to our searchers. We're transitioning to a monitoring status, ready to resume active operations if new evidence emerges or weather conditions improve." The decision to suspend active searching devastated the Parker family, but was understood to be necessary by most observers. Search and rescue experts noted that 31 days represented an extraordinary commitment of resources and personnel, far exceeding typical search durations. The harsh reality was that survival in Alaska's wilderness for over a month, particularly given the weather conditions that had developed, was virtually impossible without extraordinary luck or preparation. The cessation of official search operations on November 18, 2018, marked the beginning of a different kind of ordeal for the Parker family. The excruciating uncertainty of not knowing what had happened to James and Lucas, combined with the gradual realization that they might never learn the truth. Sarah Parker refused to accept that her husband and son were simply gone forever, launching a private crusade that would consume the next 6 years of her life and transform her from a suburban mother into a relentless advocate for missing persons. Sarah's transformation began immediately after the official search ended. While investigators filed their reports and moved on to other cases, she remained in Alaska, renting a small cabin in Talkeetna and spending her days studying topographical maps, consulting with local guides, and planning private search expeditions. Her dedication was both inspiring and heartbreaking. She learned to read contour lines like a book, memorized wildlife patterns that might have influenced James's route selection, and became expert in weather analysis systems that could help predict where someone might have sought shelter. The financial cost of Sarah's private search efforts was staggering. She liquidated retirement accounts, took out loans against their home, and organized fundraising events to finance helicopter rentals, guide services, and specialized equipment. Friends and extended family watched with growing concern as she poured every available resource into the search, often going weeks without returning home to Denver or maintaining her previously stable life. She became consumed by it, her sister Linda recalled years later. I understood her need to find them, but watching her destroy herself in the process was almost as painful as losing James and Lucas. She stopped eating regularly, stopped sleeping through the night, and stopped being present for the rest of us who were also grieving. Every winter brought renewed agony and hope in equal measure. Sarah would return to Alaska as soon as weather conditions permitted, retracing routes that search teams had covered multiple times, convinced that she might notice something that trained professionals had missed. She developed relationships with bush pilots, wilderness guides, and even hermits living off the grid who might have seen or heard something relevant to her family's disappearance. Her persistence led to several false hopes that only deepened her pain. In March 2019, a trapper reported finding camping equipment that might have belonged to the Parkers, triggering Sarah's immediate flight to Alaska and days of investigation that ultimately revealed the gear belonged to different missing hikers from a previous year. In August 2020, hikers reported seeing what appeared to be human bones near a remote creek, leading to another expensive and emotionally devastating investigation that determined the remains belonged to a caribou. The Parker family's remaining structure began to fracture under the weight of prolonged grief and uncertainty. Michael Parker, struggling to process the loss of his father and younger brother while watching his stepmother's obsessive searching, found himself torn between supporting Sarah's efforts and protecting his own mental health. Family gatherings became strained affairs where conversation inevitably returned to the missing men and Sarah's latest theories about their fate. Living in limbo was destroying all of us, Michael later reflected. We couldn't properly grieve because we didn't know for certain that Dad and Lucas were dead, but we couldn't move forward with our lives because Mom was completely focused on finding them. It was like being trapped in emotional quicksand. The community that had rallied around the Parker family during the initial crisis gradually returned to their own lives and concerns. The missing persons flyers that had once covered bulletin boards in Denver coffee shops were replaced by newer tragedies and causes. Well-meaning friends and neighbors stopped asking about the search efforts, partly from sensitivity but also from fatigue, with a situation that seemed to have no resolution. Sarah's relationships with friends became increasingly strained, as her conversations inevitably focused on search strategies, new theories about what might have happened, and her frustrations with law enforcement agencies that she felt had given up too easily. People who genuinely wanted to help found themselves unable to provide the support she really wanted, which was active assistance in continuing the search rather than suggestions that she accept what had happened and find ways to heal. Local authorities grew frustrated with Sarah's persistent inquiries and requests for renewed search efforts. Case files were reviewed multiple times without yielding new insights, and Alaska state troopers found themselves repeatedly explaining to Sarah why certain search areas had already been thoroughly covered, or why particular theories about her husband and son's movements were unlikely given available evidence. Detective Lisa Moreau, who had been assigned to the Parker case, maintained professional patience with Sarah's calls and emails, but privately struggled with the family's inability to accept the investigation's conclusions. Mrs. Parker was dealing with every parent's worst nightmare, Moreau later explained. I understood her need to keep searching, but she couldn't accept that sometimes people disappear in the wilderness without leaving recoverable remains. Alaska's environment is incredibly harsh and unforgiving. The prevailing official theory remained that James and Lucas had suffered some type of accident, perhaps falling through thin ice, being caught in an avalanche, or succumbing to sudden severe weather, and their bodies were simply beyond recovery in the vast wilderness. This explanation was consistent with known cases of experienced outdoorsmen who had vanished in similar circumstances, leaving families with the same agonizing uncertainty that the Parkers faced. Sarah refused to accept this explanation, pointing out inconsistencies that she believed investigators had overlooked or dismissed too readily. She questioned why James hadn't activated his emergency beacons if he'd had time to recognize a dangerous situation developing. She challenged assumptions about his route selection, arguing that his experience would have led him to safer alternatives if weather conditions had deteriorated as badly as officials suggested. Her persistence earned her a reputation among some law enforcement personnel as a grieving mother unable to face reality, but Sarah continued her lonely fight for what she considered justice for her family. She maintained detailed files of her own research, corresponded with missing persons advocacy groups, and consulted with private investigators who offered various theories about what might have happened. The private investigators Sarah hired over the years provided both hope and additional frustration. Some focused on the possibility that James and Lucas had encountered foul play, perhaps crossing paths with illegal activities in the remote wilderness areas where they'd been traveling. Others suggested that they might have suffered injuries that left them unable to signal for help, but alive long enough to seek shelter in locations that hadn't been searched. One particularly expensive investigation focused on the theory that James and Lucas had been forced to abandon their planned route due to equipment failure or injury, leading them into areas far from where search teams had concentrated their efforts. This investigation resulted in Sarah funding several helicopter expeditions to remote locations identified through analysis of James's known preferences and survival training, but these searches yielded no new evidence. As years passed without resolution, Sarah began documenting her search efforts and the case details in hopes of maintaining public awareness and potentially attracting new information. She created social media accounts dedicated to the search, produced flyers with updated photos and information, and gave interviews to true crime podcasts and missing persons advocacy websites. The case attracted attention from amateur investigators and online communities dedicated to solving cold cases. Internet forums developed detailed theories about the Parkers' disappearance, analyzing everything from weather patterns to wildlife behavior to potential human threats they might have encountered. While most of these theories were based on speculation rather than evidence, they provided Sarah with a community of people who shared her refusal to accept that her family was simply gone forever. Sarah's dedication to finding answers began affecting her physical and mental health in ways that concerned everyone who cared about her. The stress of coordinating search efforts, managing financial pressures, and carrying the weight of unresolved grief took visible tolls. She lost significant weight, developed chronic insomnia, and struggled with depression that she refused to address while her family remained missing. "I can't rest while they're still out there," became her standard response to suggestions that she seek counseling or take breaks from the search efforts. "James and Lucas are depending on me to find them. I'm the only one who hasn't given up." By 2022, 4 years after the disappearance, Sarah's private search efforts had covered areas far beyond the original official search zones. She had consulted with psychics, followed up on tips from people claiming to have seen James and Lucas in various locations, and investigated theories ranging from the plausible to the bizarre. Each lead consumed time, money, and emotional energy, yet none brought her closer to the answers she desperately sought. The case file Sarah maintained in her home office had grown to encompass dozens of binders, filled with maps, photographs, interview notes, and correspondence with various agencies and individuals. The room had become a shrine to the search effort, with walls covered by detailed maps marked with search areas, timeline charts and photographs of James and Lucas that served as constant reminders of who she was fighting to find. Family members who visited Sarah's home were struck by the transformation of the space from a normal family residence into what resembled a private investigation headquarters. The living room coffee table was permanently covered with search materials. Spare bedrooms were filled with boxes of evidence and supplies for potential search expeditions, and normal family photos had been largely replaced with images related to the search effort. Michael Parker began to worry seriously about Sarah's mental health and her ability to continue functioning if answers never came. He had graduated from college, started his career, and was building his own life, but felt guilty about moving forward when his stepmother remained frozen in time at the moment his father and brother had vanished. "I started thinking about what Dad would want," Michael reflected during this period. "He'd want Mum to be okay, and he'd want Lucas to be remembered for who he was rather than just as someone who disappeared. But I didn't know how to help her see that." The approaching 5th anniversary of the disappearance in 2023 brought particular anguish for Sarah. 5 years represented a significant milestone, long enough that hope of finding James and Lucas alive had essentially vanished, but not long enough for legal declarations of death or the closure that such declarations might provide. It was a liminal space of prolonged grief that few people outside similar situations could truly understand. Support groups for families of missing persons provided some comfort, but Sarah often found herself frustrated with other participants who seemed more accepting of uncertainty than she was able to be. She understood intellectually that their approaches might be healthier, but emotionally she remained incapable of accepting that her search efforts might never yield answers. The financial strain of 6 years of private search efforts had become severe. Sarah had depleted her savings, exhausted available credit, and was facing difficult decisions about whether to sell their family home to continue funding search operations. Friends and family members began expressing concern not just about her emotional well-being, but about her financial stability and future security. It was against this backdrop of increasing desperation, depleted resources, and fading hope that news would arrive in March 2024 that would change everything. News that Sarah had been waiting 6 years to hear, but which would bring answers more devastating and illuminating than she had ever imagined possible. March 15, 2024, began as an ordinary day in the life of Dr. Emma Reeves, a climatologist from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, who was conducting a long-term study on permafrost degradation and its effects on Alaskan ecosystems. Dr. Reeves had been working in the same general region where the Parkers had vanished 6 years earlier, but her research focused on environmental changes rather than missing persons cases, and she was only vaguely aware of the family that had disappeared in the area during 2018. Dr. Reeves was part of a 3-person research team documenting how climate change was altering the physical landscape of interior Alaska. Their work involved taking soil samples, measuring temperature variations in permafrost layers, and photographing changes in vegetation patterns that had occurred over the previous decade. The research was methodical and scientific, focused on data collection rather than the kind of dramatic discoveries that occasionally emerge from wilderness areas. The team had established a temporary base camp near the same creek system where search teams had looked for James and Lucas Parker years earlier, though Dr. Reeves was unaware of this connection. Her research protocols required systematic sampling along water sources, as these areas often showed the most dramatic effects of environmental changes occurring throughout the region. "We were working along what appeared to be a seasonal creek bed that had been substantially altered by freeze-thaw cycles," Dr. Reeves later testified. "The spring thaw was more advanced than usual for mid-March, and we were seeing exposed areas that would typically still be under ice and snow. Climate change was literally revealing landscapes that had been hidden for months or even years." It was during routine documentation work that graduate student Kevin Chen noticed an unusual object protruding from what had recently been a solid ice formation. The object appeared to be artificial, clearly man-made rather than natural debris like fallen logs or rock formations that commonly emerge during spring thaw periods. Chen called Dr. Reeves over to examine the discovery, and both researchers immediately recognized its potential significance. "At first, we thought it might be discarded camping equipment from recreational users," Dr. Reeves explained. "But as we looked more closely, We could see that it was partially encased in ice in a way that suggested it had been there for considerable time. The ice formation around it wasn't the kind of thin, seasonal ice that develops during a single winter. This looked like something that had been frozen in place for multiple years. The object was clearly a camera of some kind, though the specific make and model weren't immediately apparent due to ice accumulation and what appeared to be protective housing designed for extreme conditions. More importantly, it was positioned in the creek bed in a way that suggested it hadn't simply been dropped there recently. The ice formation and debris accumulation around it indicated it had been in place long enough for natural processes to partially bury and preserve it. Dr. Reeves made the crucial decision to halt her research activities and contact local authorities, rather than attempting to extract the camera herself. Years of field research had taught her the importance of proper evidence handling, and something about the discovery triggered professional instincts that this might be more than just abandoned recreational equipment. "I've spent enough time in Alaska's wilderness to know that gear doesn't just disappear into creek beds and get preserved in ice by accident," she later explained. "Equipment that ends up in that condition usually got there because something went wrong for whoever was carrying it." The call to Alaska State Troopers was routed to Detective Lisa Moreau, who had maintained oversight of cold cases in the region and immediately recognized the potential connection to the Parker disappearance. The location where the camera had been discovered was within the expanded search area that had been covered during the 2018 operations, though it was in terrain that had been particularly difficult to search systematically due to heavy vegetation and unstable ground conditions. Detective Moreau dispatched a forensic recovery team to the site within hours of Dr. Reeves's initial report. The team included evidence technicians trained in wilderness recovery operations, a photographer to document the discovery scene, and specialist equipment designed to safely extract evidence from challenging environmental conditions. The recovery operation required extreme care to avoid damaging what might be crucial evidence. The camera was embedded in ice formations that had built up over multiple freeze-thaw cycles, creating a natural preservation system that might have protected not just the device itself, but potentially any data it contained. Forensic technicians used heated tools and careful chiseling techniques to gradually expose the camera without subjecting it to thermal shock that could damage electronic components. As the ice was carefully removed, more details about the camera became visible. It was clearly a professional-grade action camera designed for extreme conditions, with protective housing that had helped preserve its integrity during years of environmental exposure. Most importantly, serial numbers were visible on the device's exterior, providing the potential for positive identification of its ownership. When authorities ran the camera's serial number through their database systems, the connection to the Parker case was immediately apparent. The device was registered to Lucas Parker, having been purchased by James Parker 3 months before their planned Alaska expedition as part of Lucas's photography equipment for the trip. The discovery represented the first tangible physical evidence connected to the missing father and son since their rental car had been found in 2018. Detective Moreau immediately contacted Sarah Parker to inform her of the discovery, a conversation that brought both hope and terror in equal measure. "Mrs. Parker, we've recovered some equipment that appears to belong to your family," Moreau explained carefully. "I need you to understand that we don't know yet what this means for the overall case, but we wanted you to be aware that we're examining what could be significant evidence." Sarah's reaction was immediate and intense. After 6 years of searching, the discovery of Lucas's camera felt like vindication of her refusal to give up hope, but it also triggered new fears about what the device might reveal about her family's final days. "I knew they were out there somewhere," she told Detective Moreau through tears. "I knew that eventually something would be found that would help us understand what happened." The forensic examination of the camera required specialized techniques due to its prolonged exposure to extreme environmental conditions. Water damage, freezing and thawing cycles, and potential contamination from organic material meant that standard data recovery procedures might not be sufficient to retrieve any stored information. FBI digital forensics specialist Agent Rebecca Chen was brought in to oversee the data recovery process. Agent Chen had extensive experience with electronics recovered from disaster scenes and extreme environments, including devices retrieved from avalanches, floods, and other natural disasters, where standard recovery techniques were inadequate. The camera's protective housing had done its job remarkably well, Agent Chen later reported. While there was obvious environmental damage, the internal components appeared to have been protected from the worst effects of prolonged exposure. We had reason to be cautiously optimistic that some data might be recoverable. The data recovery process took place in a controlled laboratory environment where temperature, humidity, and contamination could be carefully managed. The camera's memory card was extracted using specialized tools, and preliminary examination suggested that while some data corruption had occurred, substantial portions of the stored information might still be intact. News of the camera's discovery leaked to media outlets within days, rekindling public interest in the Parker case and bringing renewed attention to Sarah's 6-year search for answers. Television news crews returned to Denver to interview neighbors and family members, while online communities dedicated to missing persons cases began speculating about what the camera might reveal. The media attention was both welcome and overwhelming for Sarah Parker. On one hand, renewed public interest meant additional pressure on authorities to thoroughly investigate the new evidence and potentially fund renewed search efforts in the area where the camera had been found. On the other hand, the speculation and constant requests for interviews created additional stress during an already emotionally charged period. Finding that camera felt like James and Lucas were trying to communicate with us from wherever they are, Sarah told reporters. I've never stopped believing that they wanted to be found, and this discovery proves that patience and persistence eventually pay off. We're going to learn what happened to them. The location where Dr. Reeves had discovered the camera became the focus of renewed investigative attention. Evidence teams used metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and systematic visual searches to examine the surrounding area for additional items that might have belonged to the Parker family or provide clues about their final movements. The creek bed where the camera was found showed evidence of significant changes over the 6 years since the Parkers' disappearance. Spring flooding, erosion, and debris accumulation had substantially altered the terrain, potentially moving objects considerable distances from their original locations or burying them under layers of sediment and organic material. Environmental analysis suggested that the camera had been deposited in the creek bed during or shortly after the Parkers' disappearance in October 2018, then gradually buried and preserved by natural processes over the subsequent years. The spring thaw in 2024 had been particularly extensive, exposing areas of the creek bed that might not have been visible during previous search operations. The discovery represented both a breakthrough and a new source of frustration for investigators. While finding Lucas's camera was the first concrete evidence of the family's presence in the area, it also raised new questions about their movements and ultimate fate. If Lucas had been carrying the camera when something happened to him and his father, what had caused him to lose it? And where were they when the camera ended up in the creek? Dr. Reeves continued her climate research in the area, but now with heightened awareness of the human tragedy that had occurred in the landscape she was studying. Her work had inadvertently become connected to one of Alaska's most persistent missing persons cases, transforming routine scientific fieldwork into a potential key to solving a mystery that had haunted a family for 6 years. As forensic specialists worked to extract data from the recovered camera, Sarah Parker made preparations to return to Alaska for what she hoped would be the final phase of her long search for answers. The discovery had reinvigorated her determination and provided new focus for search efforts, but it had also intensified her anxiety about what truths the camera's contents might reveal about her family's fate. The Digital Forensics Laboratory at the FBI's Anchorage field office became the epicenter of intense anticipation as Agent Rebecca Chen and her team prepared to extract and analyze data from Lucas Parker's GoPro camera. The device had undergone preliminary examination to assess the condition of its internal components, and while environmental damage was extensive, initial diagnostics suggested that substantial portions of the stored data remained intact and potentially recoverable. Sarah Parker sat in an adjacent conference room, her hands trembling with a mixture of hope and terror as she waited for news about what 6 years of Alaskan wilderness preservation had protected. Detective Lisa Moreau remained with her, providing support and preparing to help interpret whatever information the camera might reveal about the final days of James and Lucas Parker's expedition. Agent Chen's approach to data recovery was methodical and painstaking, designed to extract maximum information while minimizing the risk of further damage to the deteriorated memory card. Specialized equipment allowed the team to bypass damaged sectors and access data through multiple pathways, reconstructing corrupted files piece by piece when standard recovery methods proved insufficient. We're working with a memory card that has been through extreme environmental conditions for over 6 years, Agent Chen explained to the assembled investigators. Water damage, freeze-thaw cycles, and potential contamination from organic material have all affected the data integrity. However, the camera's protective housing appears to have shielded the card from the worst environmental effects, and we're cautiously optimistic about recovery prospects. The first recovered files were photographs taken during the early days of the Parker expedition, showing familiar scenes of James and Lucas setting up their base camp, preparing equipment, and documenting the pristine wilderness that had drawn them to this remote corner of Alaska. The images captured the easy camaraderie between father and son, their shared excitement about the photographic opportunities ahead of them, and the careful preparation that James brought to all his wilderness adventures. Early photographs showed Lucas posing with his camera equipment, grinning broadly as he demonstrated techniques his father had taught him for wildlife photography in challenging conditions. James appeared relaxed and confident, wearing his characteristic olive-green field jacket and organizing gear with the methodical precision that had made him legendary among outdoor enthusiasts. "Dad, I think I'm getting pretty good at this," Lucas's voice could be heard saying in one of the early video clips, as he proudly showed James a photograph of a caribou he had captured with his telephoto lens. James's warm laughter and encouraging response painted a picture of a mentoring relationship that went far beyond simple father-son bonding. This was a master photographer sharing his passion and expertise with an eager protégé. The recovered footage revealed details about their daily routine that provided insights into James's wilderness philosophy and teaching methods. Morning scenes showed him instructing Lucas in weather assessment techniques, explaining how to read cloud formations and wind patterns to predict changing conditions. Equipment management sequences demonstrated James's systematic approach to organization and his emphasis on backup plans for every critical system. The key to wilderness survival isn't just having the right equipment, James could be heard explaining to Lucas in one extended video segment. It's knowing how to adapt when your equipment fails, when weather doesn't cooperate, or when the situation changes in ways you didn't expect. Flexibility and problem-solving are more important than any gear you can buy. The footage also captured their photography work, showing James and Lucas collaborating on wildlife documentation projects that would have been remarkable under any circumstances. Their images of caribou migration patterns, seasonal vegetation changes, and predator-prey interactions demonstrated the scientific value of their expedition and explained why James had been willing to bring his young son into such challenging conditions. However, as investigators continued analyzing the recovered data in chronological order, subtle changes in tone and content became apparent. Weather conditions were deteriorating more rapidly than James had anticipated, with wind sounds growing stronger and snow beginning to fall more heavily than early forecasts had predicted. James's comments about route planning and timing began reflecting increased concern about conditions that were developing faster than expected. The Weather Service didn't predict this level of precipitation, James could be heard saying in footage taken on what appeared to be October 14th. "We're looking at a significant storm system moving in faster than anyone expected. We need to start thinking about contingency plans." The footage from their trip to Cantwell for additional supplies provided crucial insights into James's decision-making during the crisis. Rather than panicking or making hasty choices, he had methodically assessed their situation and determined that acquiring additional cold weather gear and emergency supplies represented the most prudent response to changing conditions. Lucas appeared somewhat concerned about the weather changes, but maintained confidence in his father's judgment and expertise. "Dad knows what he's doing," Lucas could be heard saying to the camera during their supply run. "If he says we need extra gear, then that's what we need. This is just part of learning how to handle real wilderness conditions." The most disturbing footage came from what analysis suggested were their final documented hours in the wilderness. Lucas had been filming intermittently as they broke camp and began moving toward what James believed would be more sheltered terrain. Weather conditions were clearly deteriorating rapidly, with visibility reduced and wind noise nearly overwhelming the camera's audio recording capabilities. James appeared increasingly stressed and was frequently checking GPS devices, emergency beacons, and communication equipment. Multiple attempts to establish satellite communication contact were documented, showing James repeatedly pressing buttons on their emergency beacon and satellite phone while shaking his head in frustration. "The signal's not getting through," he could be heard saying over the howling wind. "The storm's interfering with everything. We need to get to higher ground and find shelter until this passes." The final sequence of recovered footage was the most haunting. It showed James and Lucas trudging through knee-deep snow in near whiteout conditions, their movements becoming increasingly labored as they fought against wind that appeared to be reaching dangerous velocities. Lucas had apparently continued filming to document their survival effort, but the camera captured their growing desperation as visibility dropped to mere feet. James's experience and training were evident in his systematic approach to the crisis. He could be seen constantly checking his compass, maintaining physical contact with Lucas to prevent separation, and scanning the terrain for potential shelter locations. However, the conditions they faced were clearly beyond what even his extensive wilderness experience had prepared him to handle. "There's a rock formation ahead." James's voice was barely audible over the wind noise in the final clear audio. "We need to get there and wait this out. Stay close to me, Lucas. We're going to be okay." The last coherent images showed James pointing toward what appeared to be a rocky outcropping, partially obscured by blowing snow. He was reaching toward Lucas, presumably to help guide him through the treacherous conditions, when the footage abruptly ended mid-frame. The timestamp showed October 15th, 3:47 p.m., exactly 49 hours before they were scheduled to meet their extraction flight. Audio enhancement specialists worked for hours to extract every possible detail from the corrupted final moments of recording. Background sounds suggested they were near running water, consistent with the creek area where the camera was eventually discovered. James's final audible words were incomplete. "Lucas, grab my hand and..." before the recording cut off entirely. The abrupt ending of the footage left investigators and the Parker family with more questions than answers. It was clear that something had happened at 3:47 p.m. on October 15th that had separated Lucas from his camera, but the specific nature of that event remained a mystery. The device could have been dropped during a fall, knocked from Lucas's hands by severe weather, or lost during some other crisis that the footage hadn't captured. Sarah Parker's reaction to viewing the footage was profound and complex. Seeing James and Lucas alive and hearing their voices after 6 years of silence provided emotional comfort that she had been desperately seeking. However, watching them struggle against conditions that would ultimately claim their lives was almost unbearable. "They fought so hard," Sarah said through tears after viewing the complete footage. "James was doing everything right, everything he'd been trained to do. They were so close to finding shelter." If the weather had just held off for a few more hours, the footage also provided vindication for Sarah's years of insisting that James and Lucas hadn't been careless or unprepared. The video evidence clearly showed that they had been victims of rapidly changing weather conditions that would have challenged even the most experienced wilderness professionals. Their calm, methodical response to the crisis demonstrated exactly the kind of expertise that made their disappearance so mystifying. Enhanced analysis of the final frames revealed additional details that hadn't been apparent during initial viewing. James appeared to be pointing not just toward general shelter, but toward a specific location that he had identified as potentially suitable for weathering the storm. This discovery would prove crucial for directing renewed search efforts in areas that might not have been thoroughly examined during the original 2018 operations. If this case has already gripped you, please leave a like. This helps our channel bring more stories like this and helps James and Lucas Parker's story reach more people. The recovered GoPro footage provided investigators with the most detailed timeline of James and Lucas Parker's final hours that anyone had thought possible, but it also created new urgency to locate the specific shelter location that James had been indicating in those final desperate moments. Enhanced analysis of the video had revealed enough environmental detail to narrow the search area significantly, focusing on rocky outcroppings near water sources within a reasonable distance of where the camera was discovered. Detective Lisa Moreau organized a focused search operation that differed dramatically from the broad area sweeps conducted in 2018. This time, searchers knew exactly what they were looking for: a rock formation that could provide emergency shelter, located near running water and positioned where two people might have approached it from the direction James and Lucas had been traveling. Dr. Emma Reeves, whose climate research had led to the camera's discovery, volunteered to assist the renewed search effort. Her understanding of how water flow and geological processes had changed the landscape over 6 years proved invaluable in predicting where evidence might have moved from its original location or what terrain features might have been altered by environmental forces. Ground-penetrating radar equipment was employed to examine potential shelter sites that matched the description from the footage. The technology could detect void spaces beneath surface materials, potentially identifying caves, overhangs, or collapsed shelters that might not be visible to surface examination. Metal detectors were used systematically around promising locations, searching for equipment or personal items that might have been scattered or buried. On the 4th day of the renewed search operation, cadaver dogs working near a partially concealed rock overhang, approximately 1 mile upstream from the camera discovery site, began showing strong interest in a specific area. The location matched environmental details visible in the final GoPro footage, and investigation revealed clear evidence of human habitation that had been previously overlooked. The shelter site was partially hidden by vegetation growth that had occurred over the 6 intervening years, making it invisible from the helicopter searches conducted in 2018. Ground-level examination revealed remnants of a makeshift windbreak constructed from pine boughs, disturbed soil where someone had attempted to create sleeping areas, and most significantly, fragments of fabric that appeared to match clothing descriptions provided by Sarah Parker years earlier. Personal items recovered from the shelter site confirmed that James and Lucas had successfully reached the location James had been indicating in the final footage. James's waterproof watch was found in remarkably good condition, still functional despite 6 years of environmental exposure. Lucas's backup camera battery pack was discovered carefully placed in a dry section of the shelter, suggesting that James had remained organized and hopeful even in desperate circumstances. The evidence painted a picture of a father and son who had successfully found shelter and had attempted to wait out the severe weather that had trapped them. However, the makeshift nature of their windbreak and the obvious inadequacy of the shelter against the extreme conditions they faced made it clear that survival would have required both better protection and shorter exposure to the life-threatening cold. Forensic analysis of the shelter site revealed additional disturbing details about the Parkers' final days. Scratches on nearby rocks suggested attempts to improve the shelter or signal for help. Arrangements of stones that might have been intended as signal markers were found in small clearings near the shelter, indicating that James had been trying multiple strategies to attract rescue attention. The discovery of the shelter site confirmed that James and Lucas had survived at least several days beyond their final recorded footage, but it also raised the heartbreaking question of their ultimate fate. If they had found shelter and were attempting to signal for help, what had prevented them from surviving until rescue teams could locate them? Sarah Parker visited the shelter site personally, wanting to see the location where her family had made their final stand against the Alaskan wilderness. Standing in the space where James and Lucas had spent their last days brought her both comfort and profound grief. They were together, she said quietly. James protected Lucas as long as he could. That's what matters most to me. The search area around the shelter site was expanded to look for additional evidence that might explain what had happened after James and Lucas reached their temporary refuge. If they had died at the shelter location, their remains should have been discoverable despite environmental changes over 6 years. If they had attempted to leave the shelter, there should have been some trace of their departure route. Ground teams used systematic search patterns to examine every possible route away from the shelter site. They found no definitive evidence of the Parkers having left their refuge, but they also found no human remains in the immediate area. The mystery of their final fate remained unsolved, despite the significant progress in understanding their movements and survival efforts. The breakthrough that would finally solve the Parker mystery came from an unexpected source: Dr. Emma Reeves's climate change research data. While analyzing geological surveys and environmental monitoring information collected over the previous decade, her team discovered evidence of a significant ground collapse that had occurred during the winter of 2018-2019, several months after James and Lucas Parker's disappearance. Seismic monitoring equipment operated by the University of Alaska had recorded a substantial geological event in February 2019, approximately 4 months after the Parkers vanished. The event had registered as a minor earthquake, but was actually a ground collapse caused by permafrost degradation and underground water movement that had destabilized the rocky terrain where the Parkers' shelter was located. What we discovered was a natural burial that occurred well after their deaths, Dr. Reeves explained to investigators. The ground literally opened up and swallowed sections of the landscape, then filled in over time with soil, rock debris, and organic material. This explains why extensive searches found no human remains. They were buried by geological processes that happened months later. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a substantial void space beneath the current surface near the shelter site, consistent with a collapse that had subsequently filled in with accumulated material. The void was located directly beneath where James and Lucas had constructed their makeshift windbreak, suggesting their final resting place lay beneath tons of naturally accumulated debris. Specialized excavation equipment was brought to the site for what investigators knew would be a delicate and potentially dangerous recovery operation. The unstable ground conditions that had caused the original collapse still posed risks to recovery teams, requiring extensive safety precautions and careful engineering to prevent further geological instability. After weeks of painstaking excavation work, investigators confirmed the presence of human remains in the buried cavity beneath the former shelter site. Personal effects found with the remains provided definitive identification. James Parker's distinctive wedding ring, Lucas's camera equipment, and clothing items that matched family descriptions. The evidence suggested that father and son had survived for several days in their improvised shelter, but had ultimately succumbed to hypothermia during the prolonged extreme weather event that had trapped them. James appeared to have used his own body to shield Lucas from the worst cold, maintaining his protective role as a father, even in their final moments. Sarah Parker was present at the excavation site when investigators confirmed the recovery of her family's remains. The moment brought an end to 6 years of agonizing uncertainty, providing the closure she had desperately sought while confirming her worst fears about their fate. Finally knowing what happened gives me peace in a way I didn't expect, Sarah said through her tears. James and Lucas died together, fighting to survive and taking care of each other. That's exactly who they were, and that's how I want to remember them. The recovery and analysis of physical evidence from the Parker case provided investigators with a complete timeline of the family's final expedition and the circumstances that led to their deaths. Forensic examination confirmed that James and Lucas had survived in their shelter for approximately 4 to 6 days after the final GoPro footage was recorded, demonstrating remarkable resilience and wilderness survival skills under extreme conditions. Medical examination of the recovered remains indicated that both father and son had died from hypothermia, with no evidence of traumatic injuries or other factors contributing to their deaths. The positioning of the remains confirmed witness accounts from the GoPro footage about James's protective instincts. He had literally used his body to shield Lucas from the worst environmental effects until the end. Weather analysis from October 2018 revealed that James and Lucas had been trapped by one of the most severe early winter storms in Alaskan recorded history. Wind speeds had exceeded 70 miles per hour, temperatures had dropped to 25 degrees Fahrenheit, and the storm had persisted for over a week, conditions that would have challenged even professional Arctic survival experts with unlimited equipment. The investigation confirmed that James had made every correct decision given the information available to him at the time. His choice to seek additional supplies in Cantwell, his route selection for finding shelter, and his methodical approach to survival had all followed established wilderness safety protocols. The tragedy had resulted from weather conditions so extreme that survival would have required extraordinary luck rather than skill. Sarah Parker found vindication in the investigation's conclusions about her husband's expertise and decision-making. Years of speculation about whether James had been careless or unprepared were definitively refuted by evidence showing his systematic, professional response to an unprecedented crisis. The case prompted significant changes in wilderness safety protocols and emergency communication systems throughout Alaska. Enhanced weather monitoring, improved emergency beacon technology, and better coordination between charter services and search and rescue operations were implemented to prevent similar tragedies. Sarah established the Parker Foundation for Wilderness Safety using insurance settlements and donations from the outdoor community. The foundation provides emergency equipment to families planning remote expeditions and funds research into wilderness survival technologies that might have saved James and Lucas. The Parker case became a defining example of how determination, technological advancement, and scientific research could eventually provide answers to seemingly unsolvable mysteries. The 6-year journey from disappearance to resolution demonstrated both the harsh realities of wilderness survival and the power of refusing to accept uncertainty when loved ones are missing. Sarah Parker's transformation from grieving mother to advocate for missing persons and wilderness safety created lasting changes in how such cases are investigated and supported. Her refusal to accept official conclusions that seemed incomplete, combined with her systematic approach to continuing the search independently, provided a model for other families facing similar tragedies. The Parker Foundation's work expanded beyond equipment provision to include educational programs teaching wilderness survival skills, weather assessment, and emergency communication protocols. James and Lucas's story became a teaching tool, helping other outdoor enthusiasts understand the importance of preparation and the limitations of even excellent preparation in extreme conditions. Dr. Emma Reeves continued her climate research with enhanced awareness of how environmental changes affect both human safety and search and rescue operations. Her accidental discovery of Lucas's GoPro led to important insights about how climate change is altering Alaskan terrain in ways that impact emergency response capabilities. The recovered footage of James and Lucas's expedition serves as both a tribute to their shared love of wilderness photography and a powerful educational tool for wilderness safety training programs. Their documented approach to crisis management, even in their final, desperate hours, provides valuable lessons for outdoor professionals and recreational users alike. Michael Parker, now working as a counselor specializing in grief and trauma, credits his family's experience with teaching him the importance of persistence in seeking truth and healing. Dad and Lucas would want their story to help other families avoid similar tragedies, or at least find peace more quickly than we did, he reflects. The memorial marker at the trailhead where James and Lucas began their final expedition has become a pilgrimage site for members of the outdoor community who knew their work or were moved by their story. The inscription reads, "In memory of James and Lucas Parker, who found beauty in wild places and remind us that love endures even when wilderness claims those we cherish most." Today, the Parker case stands as testament to several important truths: that experienced outdoorsmen can be overwhelmed by conditions beyond their control, that families should never give up hope when loved ones are missing, that scientific research can provide answers years after official investigations conclude, and that tragedy can be transformed into positive change that protects others from similar fates. Sarah Parker continues her advocacy work while finally allowing herself to grieve properly for the husband and son she lost. James and Lucas loved the wilderness, and I know they wouldn't want their deaths to discourage others from experiencing that same love, she says. But I also know they'd want everyone who ventures into wild places to be as prepared as possible, and to understand that nature doesn't make exceptions for anyone, no matter how skilled or experienced they might be. The case also highlighted the importance of technological preservation in extreme environments. Lucas's GoPro camera, protected by 6 years of ice, provided evidence that solved a mystery and brought closure to a grieving family. The footage stands as a final testament to a father's love for his son and their shared passion for documenting the natural world. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following James and Lucas Parker's story. We'll see you in the next video.